Well, in the last two classes talking about the Antonine period, and as you've probably gathered, the panel reliefs of Marcus Aurelius are certainly amongst my favourite pieces of Roman sculpture. One thing I forgot to stress about this though was I made the point when I started to talk about them how you get these standard poses in Roman imperial art, you know, Clementia, Ad Locutio and that sort of thing. And the fascinating thing is, of course, that those panel reliefs made probably about 177 or thereabouts, they could still be reused in the Arch of Constantine in 312. So they've still got the same message. How many years later has the mathematical wizard? 150 years later. They've still got the same message, the same imagery, even though Constantine, of course, is technically a Christian emperor. Anyway, that's by the by. Marcus Aurelius, having celebrated his victory over the German tribes with that formal triumph in the year 177, left Rome and went back to the Danube for another series of campaigns against, I think it was the Sarmatians in this time. It seemed that he intended to annex their territory, the idea being rather like Trajan. Well, the Dacians were always a problem. The easiest way to deal with this problem is to actually occupy the territory and deal with it in that particular way. We know that he had a good victory in 178. We know that he advanced north of the Danube in 179. But then in 180, Marcus Aurelius fell ill and died on what he didn't know was St. Patrick's Day, because St. Patrick hadn't been born then, the 17th of March in 180. This makes him an honorary Irishman, in a sense, you see, because he dies on St. Patrick's Day. He dies at Vindobona, Vienna, which of course I always find rather amusing in the sense that the great Antonine frieze from Ephesus is now in Vienna Museum, so there's sort of kind of connection there. He was cremated. His ashes were sent back to Rome and buried in Hadrian's mausoleum, and his only surviving son, the 19-year-old Lucius Aurelius Commodus, becomes emperor. Well, looking at his early portraits, we can see Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, great facial similarities, a lot of similarity in the beard, the sort of slightly heavy look about the eyes. Commodus doesn't quite look so depressed and Eeyore-ish as Marcus Aurelius, but you know, he looks a fairly nice chap in many ways, 19-year-old. There's slightly difference in the hairstyle, if you look at the little extra curls he's got there, slight difference in the beard style as well, very, very slight ones indeed. The evidence is that many people look forward to his reign as emperor. He was the natural son of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was a highly respected and much loved emperor. It was the first time since the death of Vespasian that an emperor had been followed as ruler by one of his sons. So many people looked forward to his reign. They thought that this particular way of succession was bound to produce an excellent emperor. Commodus would have been brought up to be a nice person by his father. He would be naturally a good ruler. And they were quickly proved wrong. Commodus had none of the military skills or the political skills of Marcus Aurelius. After a year or so of campaigning on the Danubian frontier, for example, he decided to give up with this. Instead, he proved to be an extreme egotist with a lot of neurotic problems. I know there's one person here likes Commodus, but we'll forget that for the time being. We learn from the Roman historian Cassius Dio, who's writing in the 230s, 250s or thereabouts. You're going to regret ever having said that, aren't you? I like the film Gladiator. That he describes the transition in the future, in the history of the Roman Empire, as from going from Marcus Aurelius to Commodus, the condition of the Roman Empire went from an age of gold to an age of iron and rust. And ever since the 18th century, the great historian Gibbon, we've always seen the time of Commodus as that period when the decline of the Roman Empire starts. Although Gibbon really blames it on the Christians more than anything else, but Commodus is the key turning point in this particular way. Surprisingly enough, we don't actually have a lot of information about the time when Commodus was ruler of the Roman Empire. But it is clear from what we do know that he was mentally deranged, and his behaviour was a source of great dissatisfaction, a decline in the future of the Roman Empire. He failed to support the army in its campaigns against the Germans, so there were repeated invasions and attacks from German tribes. He preferred to buy peace instead, which of course gradually meant taking the Roman Empire into a period of financial ruin. He then came up with a problem. The Roman currency was based on the value of the metal in the coin. And if you don't have enough silver to make enough silver coins, then what do you have to do? You reduce the amount of silver in the coins, you reduce the weight of the coins, and he had to do this twice that we know of. This meant that people trusted the emperor even less. You start getting inflation for the first time in hundreds of years. Added to all of that, of course, with his personal behaviour, the fact that he wanted to be a gladiator. Yes, and he made no secret of his love of the gladiatorial arena. The sources indicate that he always won his fights because the people he was fighting with gave the one-fingered salute and they surrendered to him. But we are told that in his practice fights, he fought to the death. Well, you know, it does help if you... Anybody seen the film Monty Python, what's the one, The Knights of the Round Table? The Holy Grail. Yeah, that's right, in which the sort of the Black Knight is left, he's got his arms and his legs chopped off, he's just his body jumping about like that. Well, it seems that Commodus was fighting people like this a lot of the time, so yes, he would win his fights. He also actually charged the city of Rome 250,000 silver pieces every time he fought in the arena, which didn't exactly help finances. But much more worrying in many ways was the fact he began to see himself as a reborn Hercules. He started off by renaming the months after the gods, and then after himself, and changing the days of the week, naming for himself, his relatives and so forth. And so it really didn't come as much of a surprise that he was murdered on December the 31st, AD 192, and suffered damnatio memoria. Well, here he is, Commodus, as Hercules. Here we have a coin of Commodus with the symbols of Hercules on one side. Commodus himself here with the lion's head mask of Hercules over his head. And this is the really best example I've ever seen of damnatio memoria. Damnatio memoria involves removing the name of the person from every inscription, removing all reference of him from inscription. This is the most extreme example that we have. How do we know it's Marcus Aurelius? Well, you can just see AUR from Aurelius, his name up there. And there's enough left to actually see it must be Lucius Aurelius Commodus here, and that the inscription is praising him. And it's praising him in such a way that it was impossible just to take off his name and leave the rest of the inscription there. They had to remove every single little bit. And in addition to that, of course, we have the removal of Commodus from the panel reliefs of Marcus Aurelius, from the chariot and from the Libertas scene. You know, you can just see his foot. You can see how all of this has been recarved. The historical evidence is that he was actually present on that occasion in 177 as well. On the other hand, his reign did produce a wonderful, remarkable monument, one that is still visible in Rome, formerly known as the column of Marcus Aurelius, usually referred to as the Aurelian column. There's some problems in the dating of this. The work on this might have started while Marcus Aurelius was still alive. It commemorates his wars in Germany. It could be connected with his triumph, his triumphal arch of 177. But the inscriptions found around it, not actually on it, quite clearly indicate that it was completed in 192 or 193, which would make it very much a work of Commodus. So it might have been started while Marcus Aurelius was alive, but there can be no doubt that the actual main period of working on this was the time of Commodus himself. Well, it now stands very much in isolation, as you can see it like this. But originally what you have to imagine is this being rather like the Trajan's column, set within a much more formal setting. So you would have had a temple. We know there was a temple to Marcus Aurelius close to this. Nothing of that survives. It seems to be underneath this Renaissance building here. But you can get some idea of what it would have looked like in the sense of it surrounded by a colonnade, 2 stories, so that people could actually see the reliefs from the halfway point. The same with the Trajan's column. You wouldn't be going like that all the time. You could actually get up fairly high onto this to see it. It's made of lunar marble. It's modelled in many ways very closely on Trajan's column. So it stands, in this case though, on a 10-metre high pedestal, and that pedestal is actually on a platform which is 3 metres high as well, so 3 metres below the present ground level there. The shaft is 29.5 metres high, that's 100 Roman feet. It's made of, I think, 28 or 27 drum sections of lunar marble, each of which are 3 3/4 metres diameter. And then on the top you have this simple capital like that, and originally a statue, again, of Marcus Aurelius on the top. This statue was put up in the mid-16th century. I think this one is St. Peter. I completely forgot to check who that one is. It's got an internal stairway, an entrance at the bottom, and there's a wonderful inscription found near here which indicates that even in the Roman period you could pay your money to the keeper of the column, and then you can go up the stairs there. I think it's 190 steps altogether inside. And the column shaft is likewise decorated with a continuous frieze showing scenes from the 2 major wars fought by Marcus Aurelius against the German tribes. Now, we've got problems with the chronology of these wars because they're not continuous. So it's not like with Trajan's Dacian wars. We know that one took place from 101 to 103, and then the second takes place from 104 to 106. We don't have quite that definite series of dates here. But we do have, we can sort of see in the history of the life of Marcus Aurelius, his biography was written at least 150 years after he died, so there are some problems there. We can see 2 major campaigns against the Quadi and the Sarmatians, Quadi and Marcomanni, and halfway up the column here, just like Trajan's column, you have victory, writing victory on a shield. There are far fewer spirals on this than there are on Trajan's column. You can see there are fewer spirals. Needless to say, not as much work has been done on studying this as on Trajan's column. Trajan's columns always had much greater attention. But what is rather interesting is that this does result in far fewer scenes, but there's a lot more care and attention paid in the design of this. And as we'll see, for example, the windows that give you the light for the steps are incorporated into the design. In Trajan's column, you sometimes find a window in the middle of a Roman soldier or the middle of a river or something like that. But here they're much more carefully incorporated in them. So there's a superficial similarity but there are some very important differences. Well, the base as we see it now was unfortunately cleaned up by, I think it was Pope Sixtus V in 1548 or thereabouts. He decided the condition of the statues, the reliefs on the base, were just in too bad a condition, so he decided to restore the whole thing and puts up an inscription there. We do have some drawings of what was there before he did this. One of the drawings shows that one side had a scene of Marcus Aurelius in that familiar Clementia pose. The one that is on the panel reliefs, and of course what is probably represented on the equestrian statue as well. It's assumed from this that all four sides were decorated in a similar way. Trajan's column, of course, the base, the pedestal, is covered with captured Dacian weapons, Dacian armour. Trajan's column is, the Romans always win, we're fantastic, we're mighty. But remember, the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the panel reliefs is much more sort of, going away from that. So it is quite conceivable that the original reliefs on the pedestal base here carried on that Clementia theme, representing scenes that we do see from the panel reliefs as well. The other things, there are other details. Well, for example, which is which? Want to make a guess? Well, if you actually look at this, this is Trajan's column. Trajan's column, look at the border there. The border goes along like this quite happily. There's a very heavy border. The border on Trajan's column, it varies, it goes up and down, it's got different design elements to it. Some absolutely desperate student wanting a PhD topic did decide to study the design elements in the border on the Aurelian column and produced a thesis to indicate that there were no less than 5 different people responsible in this. Boring, definitely. So there is that. There are also obvious differences. If you look at the armour the soldiers are wearing, there are quite clear differences in the armour that the soldiers are wearing. There's also the point that in the Aurelian column, the windows are carefully incorporated into the frieze. I don't have an example visible on there. Oh yes, we've got one here. Let's see how it sort of sticks up like that. Well, here they're much more carefully incorporated into the frieze. There's also the point that the figures on the Aurelian column are in much higher relief. The figures on Trajan's column is something like 5 centimetres or so high. These are closer to 7 or 8. The artist responsible for designing this could see from Trajan's column that the higher up you go, it's more difficult it is to see things. So they are in much higher relief. And there's a tremendous use of the drill to create the patterns here, to create this enormous contrast between light and shade. So you've got that much higher relief aspect to all the decoration here. There's also quite distinct differences in the imagery, apart from the fact that the soldiers have got completely different armour. They're shown with, the armour is broadly the same as Trajan's column, but they're shown with a different types of armour. And they've often got these little things on the top of their helmets as well, which you don't see on Trajan's column. So there's a difference in armour design. There is a great emphasis on frontality. Looking at this, this is a scene of Marcus Aurelius. We assume this is Marcus Aurelius, taller than the other figures there, facing out towards us. Remember the Antonine relief, the Antonine frieze from the Parthian altar at Ephesus. You've got that frontality aspect. Remember also the base of the column of Antoninus Pius, looking out. Earlier Roman art is much more profile, or three-quarter profile. You don't have this straightforward looking out stance, which seems to come from Eastern Oriental art sources. Looking at the soldiers, of course, you see them from the side, you see them from the back, and notice standing on these little ledges. And if you look at the figures in detail, not so much here, but if you look at the figures as a whole in other sections of the column, you see you're going back to this sort of short, stocky, cubist tradition. The figures tend to be more on the squat side, cubic side. So you can see the influence here, or rather generally the same sort of style here that we've seen on the column of Antoninus Pius. Which leaves us with a bit of a problem, of course. The column of Antoninus Pius is the earliest example we've got of this particular style, which becomes so common in late antiquity, Diocletian, Constantine onwards. But we've got the panel reliefs in between. The panel reliefs have to be 170. So you've got a mixture of styles going along side by side. So always be careful when you hear about arguments based on art history and analysis of styles. I mean, you can quite easily have two very distinctive styles operating at the same time. I mentioned the point about the armour. This is the same type of armour that's worn in Trajan's time, but it's shown in a completely different way. On Trajan's column, this is a man wearing what you call a chainmail or ringmail armour. Trajan's column, you can hardly see this, but here they go bzz, 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 like that. Well, they didn't have an electric drill, and they had a bow drill. The scale armour there. So you've got these very clear differences. The imagery does hark back to the column of Antoninus Pius. The artist is trying to give a sense of perspective. Remember Antoninus Pius? The people are galloping around the guys in the centre. The artist is trying to show you a view partly from above, partly from the side. This is the same thing. The emperor's not standing on a platform, he's standing on the ground. He's talking to soldiers who are also standing on the ground. The same ground level. So there is that sort of attempt to give perspective here. Well, the other great difference between this and the Trajan column is the choice of imagery as well. Trajan's column is a straightforward historical narrative. We're pretty certain it's based on Trajan's own writings about the campaign. So you see the Roman army going into battle, dealing with their enemies, they're building their camps. But you know, the inevitable conclusion is the Roman army is going to win in the end. Well, we see some of the same standard scenes on the Aurelian column. So, for example, here we've got the testudo, in which the Romans are covering their heads with their shields while attacking a barbarian fort. And notice how the barbarians have chucked down a chariot wheel to try and hopefully knock somebody's head off. We've got the standard scenes of battle taking place. We've got the emperor talking with his advisors, emperor up there sitting on a chair talking with somebody, battle scenes up there. You know, these are all pretty straightforward standard scenes. Again, this one helps make the point about the high relief that we've got here, this much deeper carving. There's also the point that what you see here much more often is instead of on Trajan's column where you've got separately made metal weapons, there's not much evidence of that on the Aurelian column. The weapons are actually carved as part of the scene. This is the top of what we were just looking at. And see how the window has been carefully incorporated so it doesn't sort of happen just there or just here or something like that. The design of the column is much more perfect. There are certain specific scenes on the column which seem to refer to individual events. There's one, I couldn't find a photograph of it, in which you see a barbarian sort of lying on the ground with Jupiter up in the sky. He's just thrown a thunderbolt down, you know, so this must be a man who was hit by lightning after the Romans have prayed to Jupiter for help. So there are some scenes which must refer to specific events that are known to have taken place in these wars. The only one that we can actually identify is this one, the so-called miracle of the rain god, which happened when Marcus Aurelius was fighting the Quadi. We're told that the Roman army was on the point of defeat. They prayed to the gods for help. The rain god appeared and sent down a heavy thunderstorm, which made the river by the battlefield site swell up. The German cavalry were trying to cross the river to attack the Romans from the side. They were swept away, and the rest of the Germans gave up a battle which otherwise they would have won. This is what the literary source tells us. This is what we actually have on the column. You've got the rain god here with his wings stretched out, his beard coming down, and you can see the rain pouring off his wings and off his arms there. You see the horses of the German cavalry struggling in the river, the bodies of Germans being washed down as they've drowned. In later tradition, Marcus Aurelius is seen not quite as being, well, he's seen as being favourable towards the Christians. And so what we find in later tradition is that this is evidence of a Christian god being appealed to send rain to help the Roman army. But note this important point, this important difference between this and Trajan's column. This is a scene in which the Roman army is nearly defeated. You don't see any references like this on Trajan's column. The Roman army, except in one or two scenes, is always winning, is always pushing for victory. But what we've got here is a scene that's historical and allegorical. Historical because it represents an actual event in the campaign against the Quadi. It's allegorical because it said the gods will come to the help of the Roman people. But the Roman people, the Roman army, are now having to appeal to the gods for help. The Romans are beginning to become aware, and this is what we see on this column, is that unlike the great days of Trajan, when the Roman army went from victory to victory, the wars of Marcus Aurelius saw some major defeats, saw barbarians enter North Italy. You know, things are not really quite as nice as they used to be. The Romans are sometimes literally fighting on the margin of victory and defeat. The other thing about the choice of imagery here is that the Aurelian column makes a point of reflecting the darker side of war. The fact that the Roman army has been forced to a level of ever-increasing cruelty in order to defeat the enemies. We see this in the great number of images that show the horrific side of warfare, the bad side of warfare, which you don't really see very much on Trajan's column. Yes, you do see one or two images like this on Trajan's column of barbarian women and children being grouped together, herded together with their young babies and their children, guarded by a Roman soldier. They're going to be sold into slavery, there's no doubt about that. But look at this. This is fierceness. This is fierce imagery. She's being dragged, being pushed like that. You don't quite see that on Trajan's column. This sort of sorrowful woman here, yes, well, we can imagine what's happened to her from her look. You get it on Trajan's column, but not so clearly as here. On Trajan's column, you don't get this kind of imagery. This is the Roman army practicing not so much ethnic cleansing, but burning the area behind them, marching off all the captured animals, the captured women into slavery, the animals to become food for the Roman army. Well, this obviously happened under Trajan, but you don't see it reported on Trajan's column. And you don't see that type of thing. But there are even more brutal images on the Aurelian column. So, for example, we have this scene, the massacre of a group of prisoners. These are all unarmed German prisoners. You can see one lying dead there. You can see this man, his mouth wide open in a scream. He's just been stabbed in the back by a Roman soldier with a spear. These guys are down here. They're being speared to death. They don't have weapons or anything like that. you don't see this on Trajan's column. This is pure brutality. The execution scene. Well, these are all recognised to be Germans, beards, trousers and so forth, being carted in by Roman soldiers, but it's Germans being forced to execute other German prisoners. So you see the heads lying around in the foreground like that man about to lose his head as well. What the designer of the Aurelian column has tried to do is something that's not on Trajan's column, is to emphasise the suffering of the barbarians, if you like, the emotion that you can see in the barbarians as they suffer. Their villages are burnt down and destroyed, their women and their children are captured and taken away to be slaves, the men are killed in battle, unarmed in some cases as prisoners, or executed. So this is the work. The Aurelian column is the work of an artist who wanted to show the tragedy of war in a series of single scenes using the facial expressions of the people involved there, the gestures. Well, the origin of this style, of course, goes back to Hellenistic Baroque. This is what you can see in the blinding of Polyphemus. It's what you can see in the great altar at Pergamum. So the origin of the style goes back to that. But the scenes also reflect the general philosophy of Marcus Aurelius as expressed in his Meditations. If you look at the Meditations, there are several sections in the Meditations in which you can see Marcus Aurelius is torn, mentally torn, between his duty as a Roman emperor to protect Rome and its empire, and the necessity for warfare, which he doesn't actually like. He's constantly at war. He doesn't want to know it. Whether or not Marcus Aurelius had any hand in the design of the Aurelian column, we can only speculate. But a person who did design the column must have been very much aware of Marcus Aurelius' thoughts and the message of the Meditations, so giving us this work of art, this piece of architecture, which is so different from its prototype, Trajan's column. Well, it's almost continuous series of wars during the time that Marcus Aurelius was emperor. Not only gives us this dramatic art on the Aurelian column, the bronze equestrian statue, which has to be related to the wars, the panel reliefs, but it also comes out in private art of the period in terms of the number of so-called battle sarcophagi. There are a great number of these that were produced in the latter part of the, well, middle and latter part of the 2nd century. One of the best examples of the general type, and this is an italic sarcophagus with a flat lid. Do check on your sarcophagi type. Remember what your sarcophagi type are like. This is the italic one with its flat lid from Amendola, and it's fairly typical in many ways. Well, you've got a battle sarcophagus. The ultimate origin of this type of scene and imagery is, of course, something like the Alexander sarcophagus from Sidon, now in Istanbul National Museum. But instead of being spaced out and spread out, and you can see it in Aemilius Paulus relief, for example, but that's historical. Instead of being spread out, you've got everything much more crammed together. Now, there's something like 50 or 70 of these, and it's natural to assume that they must belong to important Roman officers who took part in the wars. That's not necessarily the case. But we find certain themes consistently repeated. So, for example, you've got the captured prisoners and the trophy up here. Remember, female personifications. The battle scene occupies this very compact area. We can recognise barbarians versus Romans, barbarians generally naked or half naked or wearing trousers, captured barbarian prisoners at the corners of this particular sarcophagus, trophies marking the corners. These are not decorated on the back, just the front, and the sides, a barbarian cavalryman there. And this guy here, whose head is unfortunately lost, but this probably represents the person for whom the sarcophagus was made, holding his sword in a reverse thrust, going down towards this, trying to kill this horse here. This is a fairly early example. What we find happening now, most of the dating of this is stylistic, so we assume that as they get later, they get more and more complicated. It's got a Portonaccio sarcophagus. Again, italic type, a mixture of scenes on the top connected with warfare. So, for example, here's the general, or the emperor, sitting on his sella curalis, the folding chair. There's his helmet by his side. The ring on the top of his helmet, which you also see in some of the soldiers, is seen on the Aurelian column. So we can say they must be approximately the same date, and needless to say, not a single actual example of a helmet like this has ever been found, but that's beside the point. Here we have the main part of the battle scene, and again, it's fairly generic in the sense that we can't say exactly which enemy is being fought here, apart from the fact they're generalised barbarians. Barbarian captives there. There's nothing really specific. We assume that they're northern barbarians. They could equally be eastern barbarians. Some rather interesting aspects about this is this shows what we call a full mask helmet, a type of helmet worn by Roman cavalrymen. We don't know how late they go, but this tells us they must go to the Antonine period. Other helmets down the side there as well. The face of the general, again, unfortunately missing. This is a colour picture, and I'm going to do this a couple times because I want to make the point that sometimes, in fact frequently, black and white gives you a much better result than colour does. Detail looking at the centre, and you can see how the face of the man there is never finished. You can see his chin has been carved. They've never got around to adding the detail of his face, which happens time and time and time again in these sarcophagi, and nobody quite knows why. The Mantua sarcophagus, again italic, brings in a slightly different theme. We're no longer battle sarcophagus, but it's a nice piece of romance. We've got over here a prominent Roman general, a senior general, and you can see how he obviously won a victory against a northern tribe. The people are being brought in, the woman's pleading for peace, the chieftain is surrendering, his arms are tied behind his back. You've got somebody holding the head of somebody in the background. Hey, this is what happens if you resist us. Roman holding the flag. Then you've got this sacrifice scene involving a much younger man in the centre. And then on this side, you've got this beautiful wedding scene in which you've got the man and the woman, that formal gesture representing marriage here. Little boy running around with a celebration. Again, I've put the colour one on to make this point that so often black and white gives you much more detail. But there's a few sort of more detailed shots here just to show you that marriage scene. And over there, the general receiving the submission of the barbarians. They're not all battle sarcophagi, they're not all wedding sarcophagi. There is a celebration of life involved in all these Bacchus sarcophagi. Many of them show the return of Bacchus from India, bringing with him the good news about the discovery of wine. So Bacchus, Dionysus is over there, he's in his chariot being pulled by two panthers. Sometimes you see tigers, sometimes you see centaurs, but panthers are much more common. You've got the Indian connotation. There you've got the small-eared Indian elephant with a rider, and somebody's spilt the wine from the amphory on top. Here are the maenads, the female personalities who have the great party time, of course, with Dionysus, and a little satyr holding onto a lion there. And various scenes from the life of Dionysus along the top. Again, colour version to make that point. I hope I don't do this too often. Colour isn't always good, but at least with colour you can get some idea of the quality of the marble, this very highly polished marble. Well, here's another Bacchus sarcophagus, typical of late Antonine period. A slightly different theme, but you know, it's a general sort of celebration of wine drinking and so forth. Very unusually actually inscribed with the name of the person who's buried there. You don't often get this. Well, this is Dionysus actually discovering the sleeping Ariadne. The satyr finds her fast asleep over there and says, hey guys, look what I've seen over here. Whoops, I'm going to make my way there eventually. A scene that you often see in mosaics as well. Ignore these Renaissance period stands. Sarcophagi also going back more, some of them representing stories from the great myths and traditions. So the Achilles sarcophagus with the body of Pallas, about to be tied up to the chariot, about to be dragged around Troy, how many times that was. But of course everybody's wearing good Roman armour. The Melfi sarcophagus is very important because this is an Asiatic sarcophagus found at Melfi in Italy. The ones we were looking at, all Italic sarcophagi. This is highly characteristic of this region. These are made at Docimeon, Affion, not too far from Affion. This one exported to Italy. This one gives us our best dating evidence because of the hairstyle. This is Faustina Minor's hairstyle, so it's the time of Marcus Aurelius. These are normally shown decorated on all sides. They were meant to be walked around in the family tomb, and you get a series of architectural frameworks with different people in these, which may represent the deceased, who's often shown on top of the lid, reclining in sleep. Sometimes it's a couple, sometimes a single person like this. Now in this case, I wanted to put this one up because one of the most annoying things that's happening more and more often is in museums they're putting these inside protective glass boxes, which makes it absolutely impossible to get a decent photograph of it. Reflections and the shape of the box as well. Asiatic sarcophagi usually have a symbolic door at one end, a door to paradise, we don't know. And this is normally where they're broken into from that end there. So that's the earliest, well, the earliest one we can date of these particularly Docimeon type sarcophagi. The Antiochus sarcophagus, the same type of thing. This is a horror story in archaeology because this was found as recently as I think 1998, and it was lifted up under the control of the museum, and they do not know exactly which way around it was facing. They found 3 skeletons inside it covered with gold impregnated cloth, which they didn't bother saving. We don't know if it was found in a tomb. We don't know anything about it. This is a horror story from that point of view. This one was reused in the 4th century. It has 4th century coins inside it, but it's the same basic thing. You see there's a couple on the top of this one, but notice the head was not finished. And you've got the regular imagery going around the side. One of the former MA students here wrote her MA thesis on this, and then went on to write her PhD at Harvard on this type of sarcophagi. See, so there's always a chance, there's always a chance. So very good symbolism in here. And both sides and both ends of it. The Velletri sarcophagus is going into the Attic type with the sloping lid on the top of it, where you can see the influence of the Asian type sarcophagus in that architectural frieze that goes along there. Again, I want to make the point, as this is now displayed, you can walk over the glass on the top and look down on it. The whole thing is surrounded by glass. It's all uplit lit like this. It's impossible to get a photograph of the damn thing. But you can see the influence of the Asiatic sarcophagi on and its depiction of Pluto and Proserpina in the centre part. Going back to Asiatic sarcophagi, you get these garlanded sarcophagi, which are very typical of the end of the late 2nd century. This is a highly decorated example. I think this one's in Konya. But you can see, you know, somebody really go over the top with their detail of decoration. They must have cost a fortune to actually make. Much more frequently you find this sort of thing, inscription plaque, usually with a painted inscription. You buy these off the peg. Oh, I can't afford to pay for an inscription as well. Ooh, that will be another 10 denarii. I'll paint it on. So we don't know who it was for. It's the same one viewed from the side there. And in a lot of places, completely unfinished sarcophagi like this. For reasons we don't know, but people were quite happy to have that. And this one, which is not the one in Antakya, I can't remember where this one is, but you can see the man's face has been finished. But, you know, he obviously didn't like his wife very much because he decided he didn't want to have her face put in there. And that's it. All right, don't forget to sign the book.